Hey, everybody, welcome on behalf of Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust to our program this morning. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I'm an educator at the museum. This morning, I'm pleased to welcome you to our virtual talk with Steve Kovary, a Holocaust survivor from Hungary. For those who have not been to the museum before, ours is the first Holocaust survivor founded Holocaust museum in the United States. In the 1960s, a group of survivors worked together to create a memorial for their loved ones who perished in the Holocaust, and this memorial eventually became our museum. These survivors who established our museum did so with a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. Furthermore, they mandated that our museum should always be free to the public. Even though we're not able to be in our museum's physical space for the time being, and you can see it virtually behind me, we are still able to carry on this mission of theirs. This morning, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Steve Kovary, who will share his story with you. After Steve shares his story, you can type in your questions and he'll answer as many as possible. And I'm happy to say that we were introduced to Steve from Bob Jeminder, a Holocaust survivor in our community who served on our board of directors, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. But Steve has been speaking at the museum and to school groups for it was about a few months before the pandemic. But that being said, we are so happy to have him here now for his first Zoom talk for the museum. So Steve, welcome and thank you so much for sharing your story with us this morning.
Thank you. My name is Stephen Kovary. I was born in Budapest, Hungary on December 31st, 1941, the last day of the year. And I was the child of Lilian Miklos Kovary, who you'll see in the next picture. They were my mom and dad. And I was a happy little kid from the time I was born till I was about 3.5 years old. I even had a German Fräulein caretaker, and the family was well-to-do, and my father had a chain of shoe stores throughout Eastern Europe, and they were shoe manufacturing. And unfortunately, all that came to a crashing end when I was about 3.5 years old, approximately in September of 1944, when my parents, my father for the second time and my mother for the first time, were drafted into forced labor, and they were the lucky ones because they survived. And on their way to forced labor camp, they dropped me off at a safe house set up by organized by the Swedish diplomat, Wallenberg, although the safe house that I was in was flying the Swiss flag, the Swiss Red Cross flag, and it was directly set up for children by the Swiss diplomat, Karl Lutz, L-U-T-Z, and they were a network of diplomats, and I will later on get into more detail regarding their activities and their names, who took it upon themselves some personally and some with government acquiescence, to help the persecuted Jews of Budapest, Hungary. I was in this Red Cross safe house for approximately 5 months, from about September to February, September of 44 to about February of 45. And I was a relatively happy kid. I had a caregiver in this facility. Her name was Piroshka. That's in Hungarian, and its English translation is Goldilocks, strangely. And she took care of me. I don't know the particulars how it happened, but I do know that I got very fond of her. And towards the end, I sort of had an identity crisis because I thought she was my mother. And to this day, the bond is still there, I have to admit. Coming February, the Battle of Budapest commenced, where the fascists who were defending Budapest, the Arrow Cross mainly, were in battle with the Russian forces, and the battle went back and forth. And during one of the lulls, my grandfather took it upon himself to start looking for me. And he managed to find me. He later told me he had no idea where I was, but he started the various safe houses. He was living in his own apartment building, which was turned into a safe house itself on Akatsva Street, 58 to be exact. And he managed to find me in this safe house on Kirai Street, which is King Street in English, at the King Street Children's safe house. And he took me back to the apartment building that they actually, with my grandmother, they owned. They were fortunate. They hid out from periodic roundups. They had a hiding place in the cellar behind a stack of wood. And they managed to escape attention a number of times when the apartment building got invaded. So the battle continued, and I was now with my grandparents. And maybe the next picture is the picture of my grandfather. And things were anxious, but we had enough to eat. And eventually the battle seemed to have let up, and my grandfather asked me to let's go out and see what's going on, because there was suddenly a deadly silence. And we got to this grated door from the cellar to the courtyard. And it's just a story. We tried to open up the gate. We had the key, but we couldn't budge it. And so we yelled for help. And eventually the door opened, and there was a Russian soldier. And we got out, and there's a Russian soldiers were lined up in the courtyard in white fatigue, camouflage. Apparently, it was a roll call or something of that nature. But what was interesting was that the reason we couldn't open the door is because, unfortunately, a lot of the dead people were piled up against the door like kindling wood. Some of them still bleeding. It was an awful scene. And then we were commandeered by the Russians to pick up the bodies, and there was a trash wagon in the courtyard, and we were asked to pile the bodies into this trash wagon. So my kind of a cute part of this story is, if this cuteness is appropriate, my grandfather was cautioning me not to pick up any Germans because they're much heavier than the Russians, who were skinnier. And so we loaded up these wagons, and then we were ordered to carry them out to this plaza in the 7th district. It was Klausalter, Klausal Plaza. And then we were just, the better, for the lack of a better term, we just dumped them. Eventually they dug mass graves for these fallen soldiers, and they were buried there on site. And so my war experience was not pretty, but I survived along with my grandparents. And eventually my mother and father, around early March, managed to, or may have been early April actually, managed to show up totally exhausted. They were in this forced labor camp in Sopron in northwestern Hungary. And they shared that they had to walk practically the entire way, which is approximately, I would say 250 kilometers, which is roughly about 120 miles. And so that is basically my war story. And it's a brief one because I don't remember a whole lot. As a child, I was 4 years old. I still remember vividly the scene when we came out of the cellar, and I vividly remember the Russian soldiers lined up. And then I vividly remember that as a kid, I was running after Russian lorries. They were distributing bread. And one of the few words I learned in Russian is chleba, which means bread. And pasibo, which was finally I did manage to grab a piece of bread. I would say pasibo means thank you. And that's not quite the entire vocabulary I possess, but a good portion of it, even though Russian was compulsory in school. And then just to round out the story of my life, which is not too relevant, but I went to school in Hungary, and when I was in high school, the Hungarian Revolt broke out. I took part in it, and my father advised me to leave Hungary because there'll be retribution, which there was in a big way. And I took the world in my neck and left Hungary with a couple of friends. We went to Austria and to a village called Deutschkreuz, and eventually we were transported to a refugee camp and actually it's a Hotel Adlerhof in Vienna. Stayed there for a couple of weeks, and then they found room for us at another refugee camp in Wiener Neustadt. I was there for about 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Another transport to Munich, and then from there flew to Nellis Air Force Base in New Jersey. I think my arrival was January 5th, 1957. And the Jewish refugee organization lined me up with my uncle and aunt, and uncle and aunt later, and they were in the Upper East Side. I was with them for about 6 weeks. Things didn't work out, and Hayes eventually located a family who was willing to take me in Santa Monica. And eventually I was with them, and then I started I finished high school, went to Santa Monica College, eventually to UCLA, got a degree in mathematics and statistics, and worked in aerospace engineering for 5 years on mainly on a rocket plane called the X-15, and then changed careers, became a CPA 5 years later, and that's been my career for up until now, and I'm about to retire. But so much about myself. I would like to segue into the real story, not my story. The real story is why these safe houses, how it came about that these safe houses were set up, where Hungarian Jews in Budapest constituted approximately every third person in Budapest was Jewish. And after the war, which is about 750,000 Jews who lived in Budapest, roughly. Now, after the war, there were only about 200,000, which is still the largest surviving population in Europe. And in no small measure, it was thanks to the Swedish diplomat, Wallenberg, who was a giant humanitarian. So maybe we'll have a picture of Raoul Wallenberg. The next slide. Raoul Wallenberg was approached by a Dr. Laurel Kalman, who was a businessman who was entrusted with organizing an effort to save the Budapest Jewry. And this task, he was entrusted with the task of finding someone who could effectively thwart the extermination efforts of the German Wehrmacht and Gestapo. The organization that was behind Dr. Kalman was the World Jewish Congress and the War Refugee Board. And they were instrumental in recruiting Raoul Wallenberg. And he arrived in Budapest on July 7th, 1944, when deportations have already been well underway. From June through August of 1944, they were deporting approximately 12,000 Jews per week. So you can imagine how the numbers started to add up, mainly from this brick factory in Óbuda. They were rounded up and taken to the courtyard of the brick factory with a railroad spur that accommodated arriving trains and departing trains, where they were loading Jewish people onto these trains to their deaths in the various extermination camps. Raoul Wallenberg arrived in the midst of this and immediately started to organize the diplomatic community and enlisted the help of a number of foreign diplomats. And I'm going to give you some names. The number one, of course, was Karl Lutz, the Swiss consul general, and eventually became ambassador. And the Spanish diplomat, and surprisingly, considering that Spain was under fascist rule under Francisco Franco, his name was Angel Sans Brise. I hope I pronounced this correctly. But he took it upon himself to save approximately 5,000 Jews, continued his career in the diplomatic corps of Spain, and eventually received the Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Hungary. The other one was Chiun Sugihara, who saved approximately 6,000 Jews, and he issued visas to Hungarian Jews that saved their lives. And when he went back to Japan, he was in disgrace. He was disgraced, and he was forced to resign and died in relative poverty and shame for saving Jewish lives. Now, what were the mechanisms? But the World Jewish Congress provided the funds, or the World Jewish Congress and the War Board were the source of financing, where Wallenberg was able to purchase apartment buildings where the refugees or the Jewish people who he was able to, these were, by the way, mainly in the ghettos, but there were some that were outside of the ghetto as well. The ghetto, meaning, if some of you don't know, is an enclave where an enclosed, sealed enclave where people cannot get in or get out from a certain part of the city. So these apartment buildings were set up with Swedish and World Jewish Congress and War Board money, and then they were filled up with Jews of Budapest, and it was effective in a number of ways. They all of them were flying either Swedish or Swiss, or even Spanish, and there was also a Portuguese diplomat. There was one or two of those safe houses under the auspices of Portugal. And they were all issued passport-like documents attesting to the fact that these people are citizens of a foreign country, namely Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, Japan, etc. There was actually, in the case of the Swedish passports, they were called these Schutzpasses, or safe passes, passages to safety. But in effect, they were fake passports. In the case of the Swedish passports, there were only a serial numbers assigned for approximately 400 numbers were assigned. So there was actually a section of among the Hungarian Jews who had talent, who were creating forged passports with the serial numbers that kept repeating themselves from, I believe it started with 400 and went up to, I think, like 1,000 and or something like that. But these numbers repeated themselves multiple times, thousands of times actually. And they were effective because the Nazis were respecting the Swedes because for a number of reasons. One of them was the background of Raoul Wallenberg, who had a huge stature in not just in the diplomatic community, but in the world community. Raoul Wallenberg came from a hyper wealthy family who's still, the family's still one of the most powerful banking families in the world, even today. He was a son of this, a scion of this family. And he was a well-respected diplomat, even from prior to coming to Hungary. He fulfilled diplomatic chores all over the world, Mexico, South America, you name it. He was highly regarded. And he had a very powerful and forceful personality. There are stories of where certain people who were arrested and put onto these wagons with Swedish passports, where he would go out to meet the train and stand on the tracks with a stop sign, waving it, and then stopping the train, short of hitting him. And he would call out the names who were on the train, and also he would ask for the sealed doors to be broken and reopened, or to see who are Swedish protected citizens who are on that train. And he saved a multitude of people from certain death through his heroic acts. Unfortunately, there's not enough time to tell you the full story of Raoul Wallenberg. And unfortunately, there is not enough written about Wallenberg, although there is an authoritative book, but it's only in Hungarian. I haven't found it in English. And some of you might, if Hungarian is good enough, I can give you the reference. Some of the stories are astonishing. His boldness, in fact, you could almost say he was reckless in some respects. And eventually his recklessness caused the loss of his life and his captivity. One never knows. It's one of the mysteries that has never been cleared as far as his demise is concerned. But when the Russians finally conquered the fascists in Budapest, he sought out the general in charge of the battle. And actually, he sought out, and it actually was invited to join for a meeting. And it was supposed to be about the disposition of the remaining Jewish people and provisions for them, because food and provisions were running extremely low. And he had he met the Russian general, I forgot his name, but in this meeting he got arrested along with the chauffeur who took him to this meeting, and they were never heard from, although there are some rumors that he was taken to the Lubyanka in Moscow, which is an infamous prison. And for whatever reason, they kept him, but one reason, the ostensible reason was that they considered him a spy for who knows why. But the real reason probably was that Stalin, Joseph Stalin, the dictator, and I don't want to get into some of the adjectives that I think about the person, although in a way I owe my life to him. But he was holding him for ransom from the Wallenberg family, which never came forth. But after about a year of captivity, the records seem to indicate that he died. And the cause of death supposed to be a heart attack, which is questionable at his age, roughly, I think it was 35 or 37 years old at that time. But could have happened, but probably because of mistreatment. And, that's basically my story. My purpose really here is not just to acquaint you with my story, which is, a small little story with its little snippets of my personal experiences as a little kid, but to open the world's eye to the heroism of Raoul Wallenberg, of what he has accomplished. Even though roughly close to 500,000 people perished, Hungarian Jews perished, the 200,000 is in large measure is to his credit. So I owe my life to this gentleman, along with many others. And I'd like this story to take off. And, the 20th century didn't really produce that many great humanitarians. There is scraping around for looking for saints. But unfortunately for him, he's not Catholic. He could not be a saint. But if there's a saint, if there ever was a saint, Raoul Wallenberg deserves the moniker. And with that, I'm open to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing not only your story, but the story of Raoul Wallenberg, which, as you mentioned, is probably one of the lesser known stories in Holocaust history. And I appreciate so much how much attention you bring to him in your talk when you talk about your family's experiences and your own. We do have a few questions. First, we have a question from one of our Hungarian-speaking docents. She asked it in Hungarian, but I cannot read that. In English, she asked if your parents ever left Hungary.
No, they were in Sopron. But actually, yes and no. My father's first tour was in Romania. And he never shared with me exactly how it is that he managed to come home, but he did survive that one. And then the second run, they both ended up in Sopron, which is northwest Hungary, near the Austrian border.
We have question. This is a good question that I'm sure you'll really appreciate. What guidance do you have for K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade teachers who want to share these heroic stories with students?
Well, I wish, for starters, if the this book could be translated into English, which I thought it was, and I couldn't find it. Maybe it's out of print on Raoul Wallenberg. That's one. But that's not realistic because although, I'd like to see Raoul Wallenberg eventually get the recognition that he so richly deserves. It's a tough call. There was a movie about Raoul Wallenberg in the 1980s. I saw the movie. I didn't particularly care for it. I didn't think it did justice, but it's a good beginning. So maybe I would start with that. I'm sure that can be found on Netflix or some of the other, or Amazon. The other is, I didn't get into the slides, which maybe at this point, maybe we should also go into some of that, like my experience in Sweden, which I'd like to share actually. And I'm not sure if you would like me to go back and share that part of the story, because it's a powerful story actually that I skipped this time. I know in prior speeches I've went into it, but it might throw some light on the question that was just raised. Namely, I went to Stockholm in about 12 or 13 years. I think it was in 2010. I was actually in Gothenburg, Sweden. These are all pictures of Wallenberg and his entourage, his childhood pictures. His mentor is actually his father. His father died at a very young age. And if you go to the previous screen, this is Raoul at 3 years old. This Oscar Wallenberg was his actual, he was his uncle, but he was the male influence in his life. He was, and then May Wallenberg, his mother, on the left. But I went to Stockholm by way of Gothenburg for the simple purpose of paying homage to Raoul Wallenberg. By the way, Vilmos Langfelder is the person I mentioned who went along with Wallenberg to meet the Russians, and neither one they both vanished. But when I was in Stockholm, and I asked around, I wanted to find these are all pictures of forced laborers who were freed by Wallenberg at the railroad station in Josephville, I guess. The next slide is just some of the safe houses that these were all safe houses that were housing Jewish people in Budapest. And then maybe at the next screen, but this is Rolf Albertsson, who's the Swedish ambassador to Hungary. And then on the right is Folk Bernadette, Count Folk Bernadette. He was the Swedish Red Cross, president of the Swedish Red Cross. And of course, both of these gentlemen were instrumental in the works, in enhancing the works of Raoul Wallenberg. And let's move on to the next screen. So I want to Okay, so, okay, this is perfect. This is where I want to be on my story of what happened in Stockholm. So I asked around, and both in my hotel and my taxi drivers, who probably you'd figure they know where the Wallenberg Memorial was. I wanted to pay homage to the Wallenberg Memorial. And I was in Stockholm already for 2 days and I couldn't find it. And this was before I could access Google, or it wasn't that common back there. And so one day, right day before I was about to leave, I was getting a little desperate. And for one thing, I went down to the railroad station to look at the schedule. And when I came out of there, facing me was this beautiful church, Lutheran church with the golden dome, and they had a Bach recital that was advertised on their announcements. And I went to this church and listened to the Bach recital, an organ recital. And at the end of the performance, I got to talking with the minister or priest. I don't know what Lutherans call their rabbi, so to speak. And we got a nice chat. And he asked me why I was, why, what brought me to Stockholm. And I told him I'm desperately looking for the Wallenberg Memorial. So he said, well, he invited me to the sequestery. We had a cup of coffee there. And then he said, let's go. And he closed the church, closed the doors, and let's go to the memorial, just like that. And the guy walked pretty fast too. And about 30 minutes later, I found myself in front of the Wallenberg Memorial, which happens to be located in front. If you look in the background, is the great Synagogue of Stockholm. This memorial is very touching to somebody like me. Has a lot of meaning. Obviously, there's an inscription on it. And in front of this, there's another monument that refers to the escapees that Wallenberg helped. And what's really touching about this memorial is that you see that the two pieces of rail that the globe is sitting on, that those two pieces of rail lead right into the great synagogue courtyard in the background. And what's important about these two pieces of iron is that these two pieces of iron were donated by the Republic of Hungary, and they were part of the railroad spur that was where the Jews of Budapest were loaded onto cattle cars in the brickyard. So these were located in the brickyard. So these spurs led some of these people, thousands of people to their death at the extermination camps. And that's the symbolism that's so shocking to me. It's so, it's to some people, it's just two pieces of iron. To me, it means a heck of a lot more. And maybe we can go to the next slide to see the rest of the monument. This is just the inscription on the globe. It's about the peril, the the perilous, the escape, and it doesn't say a whole lot. It's in every language of the region: German, English, Hungarian, so forth, Russian. And then maybe the next slide. And this is the symbolism of the escape of the people who were trying to find refuge, and those who Raoul Wallenberg was successful in saving. And then maybe the next slide. And this is the back of we're in Budapest, Hungary, and this is the rear of the great synagogue of Dohány Street, Dohány Street. And then maybe the next slide, we'll get a little bit of, this is the rear of the synagogue, and this is called the Wallenberg courtyard in memory of Raoul Wallenberg. Then the next slide. And one of this is also a symbolic reminder, especially by its location, right underneath the parliament in Budapest. One of the things that the fascist Red Arrow Cross were doing for sport were lining up people on the bank of the Danube where these shoes are, and they would shoot them and they would fall to their deaths in the river. And this was done on a daily basis and on a regular basis. You can imagine the horror. And of course, this symbolizes these shoes were actually shoes, bronze shoes of the victims. This is just one of the many horrors that were perpetrated on the Jews of Budapest during and this happened mainly from the latter part, from around October 15th towards until the Russian liberation, when they were finally defeated, and they could no longer send the Jews to their death from Óbuda, so they would just line them up on the banks of the Danube and shoot them in the river. And maybe the next slide, Michael. This is the front of the great synagogue, which was basically the center of the Jewish life in Budapest. This is the great synagogue of Budapest, which is today one of the best, the top tourist destinations in Budapest. But it also houses a Holocaust museum, which, if you happen to visit Budapest, should not miss to visit. It has a lot of artifacts. And then maybe the next slide, I'm towards the end of this presentation. If you could move on, please.
That's actually the last slide on this presentation.
The tree is missing, the tree of sorrow. I thought we had that. But in any case, there is, in the courtyard of the Wallenberg Plaza, there is a tree of remembrance, which every leaf on this tree, it's like a willow tree. There is a leaf, a metallic leaf, inscribed with one of the victims of the Budapest victims of the Holocaust. And so I'm open to questions again.
Well, thank you so much. We're so glad that you shared the rest of those photos with us. We do have some more questions. First, did you have any siblings?
I have a brother who was born 6 years after me. He was lucky enough not to have to go through all that. And I left him behind when I left in 1956, and eventually brought him out to, after I was gainfully employed, back then North American Aviation, so I was able to sponsor my mother and my brother, and they came out here and lived. My mother passed away a number of years ago, and my brother is still with me.
That is a good segue to the next question. Was it hard for you to leave Hungary?
Actually, everybody was worried that I'm going to get sick. Well, everybody thought I was going to get terribly homesick. And strangely, I never did. I went through a lot of hardships when I could only stay with this family for a couple of years, not even a year and a half, until I became an emancipated minor. And I did odd jobs, worked in grocery stores, eventually worked at the post office, sorting mail at night and going to school during the day. And so it was not an easy travel, not an easy road. But I never got, I was too busy looking forward. I was bent on getting an education, and that was more important to me than anything else. I honestly can't say that there were some twinges, but I never had any doubt that, but first of all, I had, going back was not an option because of the retributions that would have awaited me. So that made it easy. I had to, it's sink or swim. I had to make do. Eventually, I did return, but after there was an amnesty.
How do you think the war affected your parents?
Let me preface my answer like this. You show me a Holocaust survivor, and I'll show you damaged goods. They were damaged. I was damaged. Everybody who lived through it was damaged. I was, I'll get into my damage later, but my father was especially damaged, and he died at a very early age. He was 59 years old when he passed away. And he was never the same. His nerves were shot. He was always scared because living under communism was not a picnic either. And the Hungarian leadership was by and large 98% Jewish, were more interested in ingratiating themselves to Uncle Joe Stalin than to shelter their brethren in Budapest. In fact, they made life for Jews even harder than for anybody else, any other group. So he was definitely a victim and very much affected. My mother, maybe not quite as much, but she could never get over some of the indignities she suffered when she was basically made to the camp commandant in Sopron.
Thank you very much. Now, in terms of the logistics of leaving Hungary, how did you get out?
Well, it was kind of an adventure. There's three of us. We took a train that took us near the Austrian border, which was actually near Sopron. And this was an early morning train. And what's interesting about this train is it left about 6 a.m. And I believe 3 hours later, there was a massacre at the train station at the Keleti pályaudvar. I believe that's where we left from, Keleti, which was the Eastern Railroad terminal. And there was a massacre by the AVH. But I didn't find out about that until much later, fairly recently, actually. But we got off the train, and then we started walking towards the border. And we ran into a farmer, and we gave him Hungarian currency to lead us across the border. And he did lead us to fairly well along the way, and then somehow there was a minefield, but he knew, we're lucky to find this guy. He knew his way around, and he led us to this little stream. We forded the stream, and we found ourselves in Austria. Along the way, we were basically crawling because tracer bullets were flying overhead. It's not like we weren't seen and we were shot at, but we managed to somehow crawl our way and, cross the stream. And then we found ourselves in Austria, and we came upon some border guards, and they said, welcome to Austria. They took us to the village of Deutschkreuz, and I think I mentioned the rest of the story.
Thank you very much. Do you know how many members of your extended family perished in the Holocaust?
I can't give you an exact number, but on my father's side, the family was very small. My grandmother and my grandfather survived, of course, and had a couple of an uncle and an aunt, and they survived because they were living next door to my grandparents. On my mother's side, they lived in today it's Slovakia. Back then, it was part of Hungary. In Hungarian, it's called Pöstjén. In Slovakia, it's in Czech, it's Piestany. And they were the preeminent family. They were a manufacturing facility, and they were very wealthy, and they were rounded up, and whoever was there, and the entire family got wiped out. So that's my grandfather, my grandmother, 4 sisters. My mother had a total of 8 sisters. One of them somehow managed to escape, but there 4 of them perished. And the 5th one escaped along with an aunt in New York. So that rounds out the 8. And the one aunt is the only one who survived from that side of the family. So aunts, uncles, everybody got wiped out because it was a small city. Everybody knew who were the Jews, and the roundup was complete.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question today, and that's, what do you remember about your early years when the war first started? How old were you when you were in the cellar, and how did you have enough food to survive?
Well, I was 3.5 years old when I went into the camp, and I was a little over 4 years and 3 months, roughly, when my grandfather found me. And in the safe house for children, food was provided by by Wallenberg. And this book actually goes into Wallenberg's heroics in procuring provisions for his safe house guests, quote unquote. It wasn't easy, but he always managed to get sufficient provisions for his charges. My grandparents, I don't know how came into food. They had some stored. For bread, I was running after trucks and after the liberation. And food was very scarce. And it was one of the biggest problems of the post-war and that followed all the way to the time that I left Hungary. Food was always short. There were meat shortages, there were potato shortages, there were onion shortages, and everything you had to stand in line to get. And then you walk into one of our supermarkets and you just take it for granted that everything is right there for the taking. So I go to not always, but often I think about how lucky I am to live in America.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. There's actually one more question that I would like to ask. How did other kids treat you when you came to school afterwards?
So after when, you mean when I was still in Hungary? Or,
well, yes, and then
or here in the US.
When you came here.
When I came here, okay.
Yeah.
Well, for starters, I didn't speak a word of English. So I was a little bit handicapped. But I thought that, I was well received and respected. I've never been the butt of jokes or anything like that. I've never been bullied for my lack of being able to communicate, although that didn't last very long. And I was fortunate that at the times there was actually, I went to Santa Monica High School, and they only had 4 of us, foreign students, and they set up an English for the foreign-born program for the 4 of us. And it was taught by the granddaughter of the explorer Shackelford. And it was a Mrs. Shackelford who was the teacher of, this, I think, the polar explorer Shackelford. And it was marvelous. We all learned pretty quickly and caught on fairly well.
Thank you. So I just happened to remember while reading this question that I believe it was the last time you came to the museum in person to speak, you had a group from Santa Monica High School, and it was nice that you were able to share that with them, that you first came to their school. So I want to thank you so much for sharing your story with us this morning and afternoon. We have a lot of people had commented and just said thank you so much for sharing this story. We also have one of our docents who said najon kosonom, which I hope I said correctly.
Yeah, najon köszönöm.
Hungarian.
Najon köszönöm.
People were so grateful to hear your story. You not only shared your family's story, but you just brought so much attention to Raoul Wallenberg, whose story is really important for us as a society to know. And I know that this is part of your mission and part of the reason why you speak and why you started doing this. So you certainly succeeded. And I want to let you know you had people watching from their homes from all over the country, and even people watch from in other countries as well. So these are
Oh,
people
really?
our talks, yes. And so this was very important for our community, and we're so grateful that we have you here this afternoon. Of course, I'd like to remind everyone that while the museum's closed, we regularly have our virtual programs. Every Thursday at 11 o'clock, we have survivors speak. Next Thursday, July 30th at 11 o'clock, we have Renee Firestone, who will be sharing her story. Please follow our website and Facebook page to tune in for our events. And of course, when it's safe, we hope to welcome everyone back at the museum. Again, we thank you so much for sharing your story with us this afternoon.
Well, I thank everyone for listening to my story. And I really, for the question about what to teach kids is, I think the story of Wallenberg should be taught as probably the greatest humanitarian gesture of the 20th century. I don't know of any other hero like Raoul Wallenberg. And if you know of one, I'd like to know.
Well, this is why we're so grateful to have you here with us, sharing your story. So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone. We wish everyone a healthy and safe weekend, and we hope to see everybody for our next virtual program. So thank you very much, Stephen, for sharing.
Thank you.